Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Mary Sabatino. I'm the Vice President at Galerie Lelong, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our 20th Dialogues of Contemporary Art. And today we're going to have Chris Watts, who's the artist on view with the exhibition Integration, speaking with Corinne Erni, who's the curator at the Parish Art Museum. I'm going to share a bit about their biographies, and of course, if you want more information, you can look at our website. So Chris is an interdisciplinary artist whose work seeks to revise, to interrogate, and re-examine social and personal narratives through the transfiguration of painting and installation. Currently, these projects are representations of windows, so they're switches to another layered assemblage of spaces that act as guides in an exploration of sacred meditative spaces and encounters with the immaterial and the unknown. Chris attended the MFA program at Yale School of Art, and before that, he graduated from the College of Arts and Architecture at the University of North Carolina and the Academy of Fine Arts in Poland. He participated in the Art and Law Fellowship Program at Cornell University, and he is a 22-23 Soros Justice Fellow. Watts has been in various residencies, among them the Marek Maria Pinowski Foundation in Poland, the McCall Center for Art and Innovation in North Carolina, and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council Workspace Program. His work has been exhibited nationally, internationally, and the show here is on view through May 4th. Corinne is the Louis B. and Dorothy Coleman Chief Curator of Art and Education and the Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Parish Art Museum. She joined in 2016 as a Curator of Special Projects. Currently, she's organizing solo museum exhibitions with Sam Moyer, Eddie Martinez, Julia Chang, Cause, and Raphael Lozano-Hammer. In 2023, she organized Artists Choose Parish, which was a year-long landmark exhibition series and a publication celebrating the museum's 125th anniversary. She invited renowned artists with deep roots to the East End of Long Island to select work from the permanent collection to be shown alongside their work. I don't know if anyone saw that show, but it was really great to see which artist chose which works. Earlier projects include solo exhibitions of Mel Kendrick, Tamashi Jackson, The Land Claim, and Bartolome Togo, The Beauty of Our Voice. She also initiated the museum's facade series with large-scale installations and was essential in securing a partnership with the Watermill Center, which is a month-long residency for artists with shows at the Paris, which Bartolome participated in, one of the artists of the gallery. So I'm going to hand it over, and after there'll be a period for questions and answers, so hold them, and then we'll pass around a microphone, I think. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to do this conversation with Chris. Chris, I wanted to place us right here, start the conversation here, and then maybe work backwards and maybe a little bit more in depth about your practice. I have to say, when I look at your work here, it just really draws me in. It's almost hypnotic, but because of the sheerness of it, it also takes me beyond it. You call the exhibition Integration, so I'm really curious, and I know integration has something to do with psychedelic therapy, if you will, and I assume you're referencing that. So I'm really curious, first of all, to start with, how did you make these works?
This is a collective body of work that I've kind of created over the last 10 years. So you'll see different series, 4 series in specific, and they're kind of laid out within that group. The works themselves are constantly kind of in conversations with each other. They all come from a place of my own personal kind of spiritual growth, and it has been like a jump-off point from the Black on Black on Black series, which is a series of works that were first exhibited in 2017, which showcases or kind of outlines without re-victimizing these situations of police violence engaging against brown and black bodies. And that work for me was my effort in making sense of video evidence that went to the highest courts of the land that were, for me as someone who studies the figure and the power of figure, especially in art and art history, as it being kind of this absolute thing, a figure being in a space telling a specific narrative, holding this individual power. And so whenever you have video evidence of these instances happening, and they go to the highest courts of the land and they say, well, this isn't how these instances kind of happened, or they don't acknowledge the figure in this space. As an artist, what is the power of the figure?
Right, and it's really interesting. This is the series that you're talking about now specifically. It's in the back room where everything is black. And when we had that conversation about how you started doing these works, you were talking about images and that you watched hours and hours of videos of police brutality, murders of black people mostly, and of course that had an effect on you. So when you look at those works in that room, it's hard to see a figure, right? And it's what you just were mentioning, that you started doubting the actual power of images, because even though they went to the court, nothing happened, nothing would change. These police officers wouldn't get charged. So I'm really curious about where you took it from there, that you actually went towards abstraction, which is really a beautiful manifestation of that in the black room. And I was also curious about the title, Black on Black on Black, and the way you spell it. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Black on Black on Black is actually a lyric from Kanye West and Jay-Z song. And so I kind of wanted to reestablish that in not only hip hop, but just black culture, and finding ways of kind of illuminating blackness, right? Using blackness kind of as a way to see the unseen within that space. So I'm actually kind of giving blackness more power and space for visibility. There was something else you asked me in that.
Sort of what led you from there to more abstraction. And I also want to reference here the exhibition Going Dark at the Guggenheim, the contemporary figure at the edge of visibility. So something about visibility that I'm curious about, because as we talked about that notion or that realization that the figure is not actually that power, doesn't have that power to change people's minds, and what happened from there. Because visibility is something that's desirable, but it can also be a negative. It can be something that you're trying to avoid. And so I'm curious how you went from that series to more like this series, because obviously there was a transition here.
Well, when thinking about the figure, I thought it was an elegant way to bring the figure back into conversation and bring our attention to surface, which is something that painting celebrates, right? Painting celebrates, if anything, is the surface of anything. So to bring the viewer's attention back to the surface on how these surfaces are cladded, what's being seen and what's not being seen, and what's being addressed. And what you would often see in the courts is that people would bring certain biases to these cases, right? So how do you eliminate this bias? How do you neutralize that space without taking away the power of the figure? And for me, I came to the conclusion that either create a space in which the viewer can see themselves in. It's almost kind of like turning the tides. It was like, well, the only way that they'll understand this is if this space is relatable, or this situation, the circumstance is relatable to them. Can they see their mom, dad in this situation, or their brother and sister in this situation? So oftentimes that is kind of what we fall back in the black communities, black and brown communities, whenever we're kind of burdened with these situations and the trauma of these situations. And so I think that leveraging that, but not only leveraging this idea of kind of this quiet protest,
It's a very meditative protest.
It's a quiet protest. Also for the high trafficking of Black images that are in the contemporary art world. Like how do we have that conversation?
Right, and that conversation started earlier on, even like Edouard Glissant, the Martinican poet and writer who wrote about the right to opacity, right? So where he talks about that getting away from these almost stereotypical images to something more nuanced, to salvage our humanity. And I see something like that in your work, where I feel like you're going towards something more healing, or something that brings us together as humans. And so I was also interested in knowing that the material that you use in these paintings, because you use very specific pigments. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, going back to materiality of the work, after working within those videos and that framework for so long, and doing installations and thinking about light as sculpture, light as kind of this immateriality that has a presence still. Whenever I came back to the act of painting, per se, I couldn't go back to using those traditional materials. Like for me, it was.
Why? Why was that?
I had already seen too much. Mm-hmm. It's almost kind of like going back to an old way of working whenever you've seen the light for something that could possibly be. And also, coming from kind of an experimental practice, I needed something that was more transcendent, like like something that kind of awoke something in all of us that was beyond the surface. And so naturally, I leaned towards very kind of light textiles like silks and poly chiffons, and through a lot of experimentation, arrived at this space where I was creating these lenses. To think about like other color tones and other materials in that space, these works here specifically are made from all natural pigments that were gifted to me by a Peruvian healer and shaman. And
was that a one-time gift, or is that something you keep receiving?
I feel like it might have been a one-time gift. Like coming out of making that work for the Black on Black on Black series, arrived at a place where I personally was traumatized from just this kind of just swimming in this material all the time, and there had to have been a different way. And it made me also think about like the trauma that was also being carried by communities who also burden or see themselves in this situation. So how can I create work that was how could I create work that could be a place for these communities to find solace, to find healing and expansion in this space? And that kind of created my own journey. It had to start with myself first before I could kind of create a platform for someone else, or an experience for someone else. What is that experience like, right? And that kind of led me to, traveling and doing sort of this groundwork of, is it through indigenous ways, old ancient indigenous ways that predate pre-Columbian kind of mythologies of like how we are supposed to heal each other, pre-therapy, and so I found myself in that space.
Right, and I really love the color palettes, and so you told me that they're limited. The colors that you can use are limited, but they're absolutely gorgeous, and the way that you combine the orange, the yellow, and brown, and then you have a whole other color palette here, and the way it captures light. And you know, it's made with traditional material, but it's very contemporary, it's abstract. And there's also this idea of the window for me, where you look through something, like you look at it, but you also look through it. And I guess that's where, you know, the idea of the spirituality or the healing comes through. I'm also curious about this work, which you call, I think, ambient, or it's from the ambient series. And again, there's something about, you know, the way stained glass works in churches, in sacred spaces. And I know a little bit about your background. You're from a Baptist family in North Carolina. And by the way, I think all of your family, they came to the opening, which is wonderful. And can you talk a little bit about the meaning of that and what made you actually make something three-dimensional?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you kind of brought up windows for the wall pieces, because they do function as portals into this other space. And the more that I made these paintings, and amongst my own personal travels of finding myself in temples or mosques or churches from around the world, you know, for me, I was always kind of drawn to this power of this magnetic magic power that you have when you have light in these elements and how they invoke a space. And so naturally, through my own personal practice of meditation, I was like, well, how is it possible that painting can also lend itself to creating these spaces, these portals into another mindset that's higher than our current selves?
Right. And you talked about something that you said, that you meditate before you start your work, and then you realize that actually your work is actual meditation. So
yeah, I mean, I feel like that's kind of that was a new reckoning for me.
Yeah.
That all of these are meditations, but my meditations exceeds through that entire practice, or to the making process in itself. And so what these actually lend themselves at the end, other than just objects, are these kind of recordings of this activity. And people, as they kind of look at them, they're constantly changing and evolving. There's light and all these moments in the work that kind of reveal themselves as you study and restudy and have a moment with the work. And these are all just kind of marks and residue left from my own engagement.
I was also interested in the surface, because I know you use fabric, so poly and silk. I would imagine that each of these fabrics absorb color in a different way. But you actually use something where you harden the surface, and you talked about that coming from your experience with surfing and surfboards. And can you talk a little bit? I'm always curious about how artists get to the process of how they create work.
No,
Yeah.
I think that's really important. I mean, like, a lot of the moments in my work are coming from my own personal lived experiences, right? It's like knowledge picked up along the road to create these things that help me make sense of the world around me. And so whenever I was at that place of trying to figure out a new way to kind of have these conversations, lended me to me spending summers in Southern California and being introduced to surf, skateboard, and graffiti culture. And as a kid coming from the South, that's wild, right? Like, it's like you move out, you spend time out there, then you come back to the South and people are like, where are your Timbs at? Where's your starter jacket? Like, why are you wearing Vans? Who are you listening to? You're just completely affected by that, which I was really kind of grateful for, just because I feel like it gave me the first taste of exploring other places, how other people were living their lives outside of the bubble of just the South. One of the things that I kind of picked up was the process of making a surfboard. And because of the nature of silks and polychiffons, it's threaded in such a way that if you were to pour resin on it, it falls through. So the problem was just like, well, how do I kind of create this surface for me to kind of work on? And in creating a surfboard, they use a fiberglassing technique that I kind of mimicked, which allowed me to kind of get the surfaces that I was able to create as a base. And after that is linen lended itself to practices that predate grad school for me, of just collaging, whether it's paint, pigment, or solvents, or acrylic, and other resins to kind of create this glass-like lens that essentially just bends light and color as the viewers kind of look at it.
So there's a lot of experimentation until you get to where you want to. Are you planning to take this further, to take this beyond? Or what would be the next step? Have you thought about that?
I mean, I feel like the ambient paintings are kind of a huge step forward for that. Like seeing these in as installations, as kind of all-out experiences, I think really lends a lot of power to the work and the effects that I'm interested in. With that also being said, when thinking about having relationships with certain communities and creating spaces for them to engage with this sort of kind of spiritual work, thinking about public art would probably be something that I'd be like really interested in kind of pursuing next for me.
I could see that.
Yeah.
Definitely. And then we also have the series of the lapis lazuli right behind us. A beautiful use of, again, I guess the powder of the lapis. Obviously also referencing a lot of, master painters who use lapis in their tradition. How did you get to this? Why would you just focus on lapis?
I had the opportunity to exhibit work in South Korea, and whenever I was presented that opportunity, I was thinking about trade from here to there.
Yeah.
And what were some of the first things that were traded between Northern Africa and the Middle East, between Asia, and one of the things that constantly kind of came up was lapis lazuli. It was usually traded for spices, and it just kind of gave me a point to kind of start to have conversations with the work. And lapis already has this rich, not only spiritual culture, but also just it was used throughout antique. The Egyptians used it, and it has this rich art history. And so I kind of turned that on its head and made a bunch of work that for me was kind of like writing in a journal. I wanted to really play with the power of these references that were kind of attached to lapis lazuli, whether it was Pablo Picasso's blue paintings, right? The idea of making a blue painting. I mean, he made those paintings for almost 2 years after his friend died, right? They're really sad paintings.
Yeah.
Does the color blue evoke only just that, or does it have a wide range of ways that people can experience blue? And so from that, I just kind of made it my own, and I feel like this body of work specifically kind of acts more as drawings than paintings for myself.
Yeah, it looks almost like watercolors, right? And it's a very joyful, has a lightness about it, like the sky or the water. Yeah. Do you usually work on one work until it's finished, or do you have several works at once going? I mean, they're so different, right? I mean, the material is different, the thought is different. Some is sculptural. How do you navigate that?
I was just having a conversation with a dear friend about this idea of working on one painting, and I would like that, but that's never been a thing in my practice. There's always multiple paintings going on in my studio. That's how it's always been, and I think it's really important for these works to be in conversation with each other as they're constantly evolving. It's almost kind of like, as not only are they personal meditations for me, but they're a way of me returning to actions that I've previously made for me to learn from. And so there's something in one painting that may be able to solve an issue that's going on in another, if we're just talking about formality, but also just the kind of wisdom and the knowledge that's embarked in that painting that is expressing itself in a certain way.
Yeah.
And so constantly going back and taking pieces from that. With that also being said, it's, I find myself revisiting older work of mine a lot, for inspiration. And it's just like this continuous conversation that I'm having with myself and expanding my visual vocabulary.
It's very important. I heard a lot of artists say that during the pandemic, that they had time and space to actually go back to older works and either finish them or take them to another place. Yeah. We met under special circumstances. We were both on a panel related to the film, The Art of Making It. And you were in that film, and I feel like you've made it. And I'm just curious about talking about a little bit about your experience with an art school, Yale, or what happened. You spent some time there, but then you also left. And just what it means for an artist to sort of go out on your own. And what went through your head then, or what were you doing then? I mean, what kind of work were you, as you were?
The work I was making then was visually on the surface very different. Whenever I talk about work, I realize I kind of talk about it the same way. The work, it was very figurative work. I was working by inserting myself into these Black narratives to kind of question or redefine my own Blackness within Black culture. And so I was constantly appropriating images from Ebony and Life magazine, again, using very non-traditional ways of printmaking and found objects. And this idea of kind of constantly talking about my own experience has kind of rolled into where I am now present, And I think, actually I know that if it wasn't for my time at Yale, I don't know if I'd be in this space, just because of my curiosity outside of the painting program itself to kind of be engaged in film and film theory and the history of film. There was a lot to kind of grab while I was there. I think that went unseen and unnoticed, but the good stuff usually does, so it works out.
It always does. It always does. But it takes a lot of courage to just go out on your own, I think, as an artist, because you rely a lot on connections and relationships as you grow in your career.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that I remember vividly, not about my time at Yale specifically, but my time afterwards, was this urge to get back into the world. And right afterwards, I moved to Paris, and I didn't have a studio there, so I wasn't actually like making paintings.
That was like 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah, more or less.
More or less, yeah.
I wasn't actually making paintings while I was there, but I was immersed in a wonderful group of writers and musicians, and we collaborated on a lot of different things. But I think for me, it was so important to kind of get back and making work about life and life experiences. And I think that's the chokehold that sometimes academia does for an artist. Right. If they're not, if they're in it and they're making books about artists, in academia, and having those conversations and wants to immerse themselves in that history, that's where you find that. But if you're the type of person that just needs to solidify this voice so you can express yourself or understand the world around you, being in the world is where that happens.
Well, I think you've really found sort of your own language of, taking from history, taking from your own life, and experimenting with material. And I think the fusion of it all is just really, it's an amazing result. So, yeah. I think, how are we doing with time? Should we open it up to?
We can rant if you
Well, I was also curious who influenced you. I mean, are there influences of other artists that you're?
I think it's appropriate to talk about one artist in particular, Sigmund Polk, who I came across at this time of me leaving school through two retrospects. One was in New York at MoMA, and the other one was while I was kind of jet setting around Europe. It was in London at the Tate. And I thought it was really interesting that, you know, the universe has ways of kind of putting things in your path for you to like look at and come back around and to re-examine. Fast forward, almost a decade later, I'm in Peru being gifted these pigments from this healer, and I knew that I was going to use them in some
Did you tell him you were an artist? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, like, that would have been wild if he would have just given them to me, like, hey, I know that you needed to use these. I'd be like, God? So he did know that, or they knew that. And I come back, I'm kind of in my studies and trying to figure out this pigment, which is a natural, they're all natural pigments. So they're usually sourced from mushrooms or minerals or flowers or pollen. And if you think about natural pigments, they don't react the same way to the same substance, right? Whether it's water, being exposed to too much air, or a certain type of level of acidity will change and manipulate the color over time. And so with my studio kind of being a laboratory for that, I'm working on this, but at the same time, I'm also looking for other sources, and I come across a body of work that Sigmund Polk made, or he exhibited in the 1980s. It was at Carnegie Mellon, and the title of the series was called "The Spirits That Lend Strength Are Invisible." And so I'm reading about this work, and he literally was making work using natural elements from the Americas, on contrary to what was the norm for using European-style pigments. And the spirits that lend strength are invisible is a old Native American saying. And he only made 5 of these works, and they're massive. This was after he passed that I found this, and being already kind of in this way of working and in this conversation, I felt like we were having a conversation like through the generations of ourselves, right? And I thought it would be a beautiful homage to not only him as an artist, but the continuation of my own practice. So all of the works that are made with the Peruvian pigments are titled the same. And they pick up off number 5 and they start at number 6. I believe this exhibition maybe has number 45 in there, so there's been a whole series, evolutions of works. And that's one thing I was always kind of really amazed by his practice, was his ability. I was always wondering why he didn't continue the series, but if you know anything about his work, he was, if you walked into one of his exhibitions, it felt like a group show. He was constantly pushing and testing and trying different things, which as an experimental artist myself, I was really a huge fan of.
Right. So I can see how that was an important influence in your work. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Should we open it up to? Yes.
John will point this microphone at whoever is at. So if you could just raise your hand so he'll know, and that will amplify your voice.
Any questions?
Thank you so much. And Chris, you've talked really beautifully about the materials and substrates and the supports you're using, but I'm wondering about tools. I don't see brush strokes or fingerprints, and I was wondering what that moment of application is like for you when making these, and if they're flat or vertical. I see some drips, but just curious about that kind of more embodied experience in the work.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Did anyone hear the question?
Yeah, the work is kind of created very serendipitously in that regard. Like, I'm usually looking for anything that will make a mark, different new ways of making a mark. The works are made on the floor, standing up, slanted, you name it.
Are you using a brush?
I do use a brush from time to time. And I think the reason for that is to hide these marks. I feel like whenever you have a mark or a fingerprint, it's something that's so identifiable, and I think it goes straight to the mind. And I'm not interested in creating an image that goes to the mind for it to be relatable. Oh, that's a cloud, or that's a person, or that looks like a face. Like I don't want it to go to your mind. The feeling or the experience that I'm interested in the viewer having is one that's beyond that. And so a lot of those marks, if they show themselves or reveal themselves, I think it's just the nature of the material that I'm using at the moment. It's a matter of fact. But for the most part, it's a constant search for something that's unrecognizable but very familiar.
I'm curious about this work where you leave the upper part, either leave it or it's white, for a large part. What was going through your mind when you were doing that?
Insinuating that the space that's not being filled or the void is just as important as the other. And there's this kind of space that's in between, whether it's just the space in between reality and the spiritual, or the physical and the non-physical, that I wanted to give the most attention to.
Mm-hmm. And did you actually apply white paint, or is it just left?
I don't. Yeah, one of the pigments that was gifted to me was not white.
Was not.
Okay. So yeah.
Interesting.
It's just the space of the wall behind it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have other questions from the audience? Yes, back there.
Of these pieces here, what would you say is the one that you're most emotionally attached to?
It's always the first one and the last one of the series. It's the last one there, and the first one was the one that's right behind me. There's this thing for me that, like, the first one is always gonna be the one that's built up the most, because I'm kind of like working through the beginning of this journey of making a series or a body of works. Even if it's just 2 or 3 works, it's kind of like a reintroduction. And that's also pending on what I may have experienced over the last month or the last day or that day itself. Where the ending, I feel like it's always a start of a conversation as I'm like closing out a series of works. And so there's always this feeling like the conversation's incomplete. And so it kind of holds a special place for me to like want to return back to working. It's a great question, actually.
My question is, you have some in the black, that are sewn, or it seems like they're sewn, they're put together. Is there a purpose behind that, and what drives the connection of 2 different pieces?
Yeah, in the beginning, it was completely formal. Silk only comes, anyone who's in fashion knows that silk only comes at a certain length. So for me to kind of fill that void of creating a total surface, I had to sew them together. And the more that I started sewing these works together, I realized I was just continuing a tradition that I had already been engaged with, was this collage. And creating, and again, it's another way to create marks, or create space.
But I think that the fact that they are collage, that's kind of like their identity, or that's what makes them, which is different to what is here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was to my earlier question, how silk absorbs the paint versus polyester. I would think that silk absorbs it a lot more than poly, because poly is artificial.
You mean like the pigments itself?
Yes, how it absorbs the pigment.
Yeah, completely different, and
Yeah.
it's also because of that threading and the point that you just made. Things live on the surface completely differently than with the poly. So there are ways of kind of enhancing that or kind of pulling that back by using acrylics and acrylic mediums, but yeah.
So you've been using mostly poly lately?
For these works, absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
great. Just another one? Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
two questions that are kind of related. One, what is your favorite part of your process? And what drives you to continue making work?
My favorite, the favorite part of the process is, it's quite selfish actually. It's like creating moments that surprise myself. And that's also the thing that kind of drives me, consequently. The moments of me being surprised are, I feel like, moments where I'm actually kind of lost in the meditation of the work. You don't see it happen, you don't feel it happen, it just kind of innately happens. And you probably don't recognize it until the day afterwards, when you take some time away from what you just experienced. So yeah.
At one point you mentioned found objects, and I can't recall if it was sort of like Paris or out west. But could you elaborate a little bit? Just tell me about some found objects that surprised you, or a piece here that was very unique to that.
I mean, other than the pigments themselves, there's not a lot of found objects embedded in this work personally. But the work that I've made in the past, where I was working with found images that were printed on objects, just living in North Carolina, you have a lot of accessibility towards like vintage and used things, whether it was at thrift stores or throwaway flea markets or what have you. And that's where I actually sourced my collection of Life and Ebony magazines and Jet magazines. If you went in my studio then, you would just see piles of magazines everywhere. And I was always in search. People were like, yeah, well, what are you looking for when you're searching for people or images in general? It was almost kind of like playing a director. I was like looking for images and expressions by people that were particularly moving for me, but I didn't particularly know how that was going to work when I orchestrated these larger images. Yeah, it was quite tedious work.
So I'm curious again about the notion of images. Do you think of certain images or people when you make these works, or is it really are you just completely in the abstract realm?
Completely in the abstract realm.
Okay.
The body is always like pushed forward
Yeah.
in these works, whether it's the reflection of the person who's viewing it themselves, or this kind of renegotiation as the epidermal, the skin as surface. It's a very bodily existence that you're kind of confronting.
Very organic.
Yeah.
And the frames, I think you use special wood, so they're specifically fabricated, I would imagine, they're part of the work.
The frames that are with the paintings themselves are stained, but the pieces for the ambient paintings is really specific. They are from an area in Nigeria called sapele. The wood is called sapele, but it's a mahogany. Yeah, that entire series is made with sapele.
It's beautiful. You can tell that it's something that you thought about, that it was important, the choice of the wood, to frame it. Oh, more questions. Okay.
How do you balance your creative workflow
consumption and appreciation of other people's art, and then also if your life outside of being an artist?
Anyone who knows me, I don't spend a lot of time in viewing other people's work, especially when I'm in the studio making or preparing for something. I think it's really important part of the meditation process to be inward, to maximize my presence and my existence within my own practice. I guess you could say in the off season per se, like I love being inspired by peers of mine. But it's a, I don't know, I think, I'll just speak for myself. I think at some point I became very disciplined at knowing when to intake certain information in order for me to kind of create a habitual practice that was safe for me and that promoted growth and expansion for me. And that could be different for a lot of other people. So I think my way is kind of really specific. Yeah.
I know that you mentioned film and video when you were studying at Yale.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything that either consciously or subconsciously might influence your work in a cinematic kind of way? Is there something about some, especially the larger scale works, that I see as being sort of cinematic or akin to film and video?
Yeah, I mean, the black on black series is it lends itself to that the most. I mean, the way the room is situated, being on the black wall, the paintings being lit in a really specific manner, very dramatic and theatrical way. But the layout and the restrictions of how the work is displayed is the same way that you would think about laying out a video installation piece. It's really specific parameters. And so, do I see myself as a filmmaker in the future? I mean, who knows? Who knows?
I think about Richard Mayhew when I look at your work. I was wondering if you think about landscaping.
I love Richard Mayhew, and I love Richard Mayhew's work. And his palette has kind of been a huge inspiration for me over the last 3 years. Not in the landscapes, not in the way that that we may have think of landscapes as it being a geographical setting of a really specific place that has natural elements. Again, I'm not interested in creating spaces like that. The spaces I'm interested in creating are that of the immaterial. So we'll do that meditation, what that provokes a mental image for you of a landscape, then I think that's just where you are in that meditation and taking information from the work.
I think you've been waiting for that.
So talking about the frames, most of your wall-hung work is overlaid on the star stained wood, but the lapis lazuli paintings back here are placed within a white frame. Could you talk about that choice?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really good eye, actually. I was, again, thinking about these as drawings, and traditionally drawings are kind of set in this framework. And so I kind of wanted to mimic that, you know? I think something that keeps showing up in the work of my practice is, how do I allude to this mysterious space? How do I call into question that you're experiencing, what you're experiencing and how you're experiencing it? And so there is kind of this chic way of you second guessing what you're experiencing. And I think that was just kind of like a play on what the lapis lazuli works, as they not only look like windows or mirrors, you're still, even though you have a list of ingredients of how the thing is made, you still don't know how it's made. And that kind of speaks to this experience of otherness especially as a person of color in this world, and that gray area in that space. And I would say the same for these, but the framing is exposed as a sort of unveiling. There's transparency, there's a truth where, again, you see everything that you need to see, but then there's this miscommunication with your eye and your brain and the play on light on how you're experiencing the surface.
I wanted to ask a
question. How do you approach looking at artists whom you don't know? You know, for example, the first time you see an artist, what's your kind of mode of attack to understand the work?
It's for me?
Yeah.
Oh.
As a curator.
Right.
Since your job is to look and select.
I try to have a very immediate gut reaction before I even start something with my brain. You know, it just has to speak to me. I spend time with it. And so that's why openings are not good for looking at art. It's too many people in the space, but I usually go back and I just look at it, and I go to almost everything where I see this could pique my interest. And you know, I have no idea, maybe sometimes I don't know the artist, I don't know. This is what happened with Tamashi Jackson. I mean, I didn't know who she was. I knew she was just closing her show at Tilton, and I had to go, I had to see it, and had an immediate reaction to it, you know, and met her, and that's where we started talking. So it has to have that immediate, it has to speak to me, and then I start sort of saying, oh, you know, this reminds me of so and so, and basically, you know, do I respond to it? Yeah. But yeah, I think as a curator, you have an obligation to go see as much as possible, and not just go see, you know, the usuals or what's, you know, what's out there being told to you. So.
Are there any other questions for Chris or for Corinne? Well, then I'll thank our wonderful guests. So thank you so much. As you can see, thanks to John Cancro for filming, to Eve O'Brien, and to Grace Hong and Rita at the front door, and all the team here for the organization. And Chris, thanks for giving us your work to show. And the show continues through the May 4th, and this conversation will be online sometime in the next few weeks. Okay, so thank you all for coming, and we hope we'll see you again.